decade friends and on the board of this Alliance of Campus Evangelists, Aaron and Aaron Wentz. So we have Franco Gennaro and several others that Rice Brooks and others that have been on here doing quarterly trainings. About every third week of each quarter, we had this training. So Dr. Frank, we're so thankful that you were willing to be here today. We'd love for you to tell us about your website resources, your podcast resources, and particularly, I've been watching you as you've been doing, I think it's on Monday nights, this apologetics presentations, and I said, it would be so helpful if Frank could take all that he knows, all of his expertise, and help these campus evangelists to be able to be equipped for this moment out on the college campuses when the Bible and the credentials of the Bible are being questioned, and yet there's great revival that we see happening from campus to campus. So Dr. Frank Turek, thank you so much. We're glad that you're here. Take it away, my friend.
Well, yeah, thanks, Leo. You mentioned you wanted to talk a little bit about archaeology. We have a small group here, though, so we could talk about whatever you want. I mean, I can go through a little bit of a presentation. We've just done 22 one-hour presentations on digging up the Bible, where we looked at the top archaeological discoveries. And even in 22 hours, we couldn't cover them all. But I thought I'd spend just a few minutes on the archaeology of Jesus, since he is the central figure. So let me just spend a few minutes on that, and we can go in any direction you want after that. When we were done with this presentation in lesson 22, we pointed out that, let me just get this thing working here. Hang on a second. There's been at least 73 people in the Old Testament that have been confirmed in the dirt. In other words, inscriptions, references to 73 people in the Old Testament. At least 34 people in the New Testament have been confirmed. This is after spending 22 hours presenting, okay? We just added it all up. Hundreds of places and sites the Bible talks about, and several events. We're not done counting. We don't know how many events have been confirmed, but several are. Now, if you want to see the people, here they are. Write these down, guys. Okay. These are all the people from the Old Testament. And notice they come from different countries: Egypt, Moab, Aram, Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom, Assyria, Babylonian, Persia. There's at least 73 names. Some of these are obscure names that appear in like Jeremiah 38, you know, like a scribe or somebody. And we found his bullia, his seal. Some of them are big names like Isaiah. We have a bullia, a seal of Isaiah. We have one of King Hezekiah. We have a seal of Jezebel. We have Jehu in the black obelisk of Salmaneser. We've got so many different people that you know that there's a lot of historical truth in the Old Testament. You can't obviously prove everything, but when you find 73 people from all these different nations being mentioned in the Bible and found in the dirt, you go, this is not a fairy tale, right? Here are some of the New Testament characters that have been discovered, from Jesus and his followers to religious authorities to Roman rulers and royalty and to some other folks. There's at least 34, maybe 35 of them, depending upon how you count them. Now, as you know, the New Testament covers a lot shorter period of time than the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament's covering a couple thousand years at least, and the New Testament's covering about 60. So you're going to find a lot more people in the Old Testament. Now, I thought we would just spend a little bit of time on what archaeological evidence do we have that supports the crucifixion of Jesus. Maybe we'll get into empty tomb and resurrection, but the crucifixion is very interesting because there is a lot more historical evidence for this than you might expect. For example, with regard to the crucifixion, this is a relatively new discovery. Where was Jesus before Pilate, his trial before Pilate, called the Praetorium? For a long time, people thought it was inside the city, the old city of Jerusalem. Have you guys been to the old city? Most of you
Yes.
have been there?
Yes, I've
Okay.
been there.
Okay. Mark 15 talks about the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. And that was thought to be somewhere inside the city. But in the past couple of decades, it's been realized this is not inside the city at all, that it was up against the wall of the city. If you guys know where the Jaffa Gate is
Yeah.
in Old Jerusalem,
Mhm.
if you go into the Jaffa Gate, or if you're about to go into the Jaffa Gate, if you take a right before you go into the gate and go down a couple hundred yards, you're going to find this area known as the Praetorium, and you'll see why here in a minute. Do you see the area up against the wall there that looks like steps? Okay, right over there.
Yes.
Why would anyone build steps into a wall? Well, nobody would. That's the point. In ancient times, in Jesus's time, this was a gate. In fact, if we back out of there, you see both sides of this. You've got these rocks lining up toward the wall. That was a gate on the western side of the old city. Now, most of the stones that you see stacked here were put there by a Muslim leader. I think it was Suleiman, who put them up there in about 1500 AD. So the city wall that you see in Jerusalem now is about 500 years old, although it was built on part of the original wall. And those steps right there were going into Pilate's palace there, or where Pilate would have tried Jesus. So you can see they go right into this area, and there was a bema seat there. Do you see that right there?
Mm-hmm.
That was the judgment seat where the circle is now. Now, recently that has somehow been knocked over because archaeologist Joel Kramer, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, actually did a little video on this that you're going to want to see yourself. But in any event, this is right up against the wall, the ancient wall of Jerusalem. And Mark 15 says, as you know, a certain man from Cyrene, which is present-day Libya, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. If he's coming in from the country, the Praetorium can't be inside the city. The gate must be right up against the city wall, or the Praetorium must be right up against the city wall. Now, hold on to Simon of Cyrene, because we're going to see a discovery related to him here in just a minute. In other words, the area we're talking about is right here. Do you see that? This is an aerial drawing of the old city of Jerusalem. There's the temple. There's the Antonia Fortress. There's Golgotha. Now, as you know, if you just go a little bit north of this Praetorium area, you're going to see the Jaffa Gate. And that area that says former quarry is now inside the old city, when in Jesus's day it was outside the old city. And what is Golgotha? That is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is so commercialized now you wouldn't really recognize it as the place Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. But most archaeologists say, yeah, that's the real place. One of the reasons we know it's the real place, because Hadrian, the Roman ruler in about 135 AD, in an effort to stamp out Christianity, marked that spot with a temple to himself, or to Jupiter and himself. In other words, he was trying to stamp out Christianity. He inadvertently marked that site. He also inadvertently marked the temple site and the site in Bethlehem where Jesus was born. He was trying to stamp out Christianity, but what he actually wound up doing was he wound up marking these sites. So when Constantine's mother, Helena, arrived in the 300s AD, she knew exactly where these places were. All right. Now, here is a kind of a graphic view of what the trials were like for Jesus. We know where the Garden of Gethsemane was. That's at the top of the screen. And he was taken to the place of the high priest. We think we know where that place was too. Then, of course, the high priest sent him to Pilate, and then right there at the Praetorium. And then Pilate sent him to Herod's palace, which wasn't far away. And then Herod sent him back to Pilate. And then from that point, he was brought to be crucified. And Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, was conscripted to carry the cross. All right. Now, this guy, Joel Kramer, how many of you have heard of this guy? Do you know who this guy is? He's got a great YouTube channel. It's called Expedition Bible. He's probably got about 50 videos on there. He's an archaeologist. He grew up in Saudi Arabia because his father worked for Aramco, with the Arabian American oil company. He spent 10 years in Jerusalem, going to university there and studying under Shimon Gibson, archaeologist, not a Christian, but a guy that now is here at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, but he was there, I believe, at either Hebrew University or one of those universities in Jerusalem. Shimon Gibson is the guy that discovered where the Praetorium really is. He excavated that whole area, because the whole area I just showed you with the gates and everything, that was under dirt in the 1970s. He's the guy that excavated it. So if you go to the Expedition Bible YouTube channel and you look at, is this where Jesus was tried by Pontius Pilate, you'll get a full video view of this. It's well worth watching. So we know where the Praetorium was. We also know that crucifixion occurred in the first century in Jerusalem. There's been at least 2 of these bones found. This was found in 1968. It's the remains of a crucified man. And in fact, with regard to this was found in an ossuary, which is a burial box that the Jews used from about 20 BC to 70 AD, that they would put the bones of a deceased person in. And this crucified victim was given a proper burial. You know, you have people like Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, saying, oh, Jesus was probably, buried in a shallow grave or that kind of thing. And, he wasn't given a proper burial. No, crucified victims were given a proper burial, as this proves. By the way, the nail going through the heel bone here, normally they would take nails out and reuse them. They couldn't get this nail out. You see how it's bent at the end? So there's been 2 of these found. And if those of you have ever been to the Israel Museum, you can see this on display. The heel bone going in, or the nail going through the heel bone of the crucified victim. Now, look at some of the people that had something to do with the crucifixion of Jesus. You got Caiaphas here, mentioned in Matthew 26. You've got Peter here, mentioned in Luke 22. You've got Pilate and Jesus mentioned here in John 18. You've got Herod mentioned in Luke 23. You've got Simon of Cyrene mentioned in Mark 15. Every one of these people in yellow you hear have been discovered, you've seen in yellow here, has been discovered in the dirt. Okay, so there have been 6 characters related to the crucifixion of Jesus that have been discovered in archaeology. And here are the discoveries. The one on the left there, that's Herod. We know that Herod existed not only from Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD, but there's coins from Herod. He was the tetrarch of this area. Now, he was, of course, the son of Herod the Great. And you may know that after Herod the Great, his kingdom was divided up among his sons, and Herod Antipas was one of them. We've got Simon of Cyrene. His son, Alexander's ossuary or burial box was discovered actually in 1941 in the Kidron Valley. Here it is right here. And it says on the side of it, Alexander, son of Simon. It also says that Alexander is a Cyrenian. Now, what are the odds this guy from Cyrene would have a father named Simon and be buried in an ossuary in Jerusalem? Probably pretty small. So we're relatively certain this is the son of Simon of Cyrene. So this is the son of the guy who carried Jesus's cross. And by the way, the ossuary was used about a year after somebody died. They'd go into the tomb. By that point, the flesh had decayed, and they would take the bones and put them in this limestone box and then reinter the remains because they believe in a bodily resurrection. There's been well over 1,000 ossuaries discovered in and around Jerusalem, and this is just one of them. Simon Peter has been discovered in at least 2 locations in the Holy Land, up near the Sea of Galilee, one in Bethsaida, which was his hometown. That was just discovered just a few years ago. And also, graffiti was found in the house, in Peter's house in Capernaum. And for those of you that go to Israel, you always go to Capernaum. It's my favorite spot in Israel. You know, Jesus was there, and you can see Capernaum, an old fishing village. You can see the synagogue built upon the synagogue that Jesus taught in. You can also see Peter's house. There's a church built over it. It looks like the Millennium Falcon now. The Roman Catholics built a church over that house of Peter. And in that house, underneath the Roman Catholic Church has like a plexiglass floor. You can look down and see this house, original house. In the second half of the 1st century, that house was converted to some kind of church. It was a holy spot, and graffiti has been found in it that mentions Peter. So this was probably Peter's house, the house at which Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, who was sick in the house. Very close, like a 15-second walk from the synagogue there. All right. This is one of the most fantastic archaeological discoveries, I think, in history. This is the burial box of Caiaphas. The ossuary of Caiaphas, discovered by accident by a construction crew in the Talpot area, I believe, of Jerusalem in 1990. You see how ornate that particular ossuary is. And on the side of it, it identified the remains as the remains of Joseph Caiaphas. The only Caiaphas we know from history is the Caiaphas of the New Testament story, where he is the high priest. His father-in-law Annas was serving kind of as a co-high priest at the time. And so when they discovered this ossuary, they discovered inside it the bones of a 60-year-old man and his family. So not only do we know that Caiaphas has existed, we have his bones. Notice how ornate the ossuary is. This was obviously someone special. By contrast, look at the ossuary of Alexander of Cyrene. There's not much on it. It's just a box. When you go to the Israel Museum, you will see the Caiaphas ossuary sitting on a glass table. I'm surprised it's not behind glass. You can just reach out and touch it, but if you touch it, you'd probably be shot. But it's there. It's just sitting out there right next to the heel bone of that crucified man. So Caiaphas has been discovered. Pilate has been discovered, not only in the writings of Josephus, but in this inscription discovered in 1961 in Caesarea, Israel. Now, the headquarters for the Romans was not Jerusalem. They were not dumb. The headquarters for the Romans was Caesarea. Why? Because that's up on the Mediterranean. That's a beautiful area. That's like going to Club Med there. So that's where they hung out. And Pilate, the prefect of Judea, was found on this dedication inscription. And as you know, Pilate was only the governor for about 11 years, from 26 to 37 AD. And this says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. We also have rings from Pilate, like a stamp he would use to stamp a seal of a message he would send. There have been coins, I believe. Josephus mentions him. There's no doubt that Pilate existed. Also, Jesus is mentioned in this archaeological discovery. It's obviously not his ossuary. It's the ossuary of his brother James, the same guy that wrote the book of James. This was discovered on the antiquities market in 2002, and on the side of it, it says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. very unusual to put a brother on an ossuary. You would put son of, but if you just look at statistics, the odds that you would have James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, it would probably be just one, maybe two possibilities in all of Jerusalem at the time. Now, when this thing came to market, a lot of people thought it was a forgery, and it actually went to trial because it's illegal in Israel to forge antiquities. So this went to trial, and it went through the entire process, went through a whole bunch of testing, and the trial resulted in an acquittal because scholars believe this is legit. Not only is the ossuary legit, but the inscription is legit because they found patina in the inscription, which goes back to the 1st century. So they think this is the real ossuary of the brother of Jesus. So there you go. You've got 6 people who have been discovered in the dirt related to the crucifixion of Jesus. And for a bonus, we're going to do 7 because there's been a 7th discovered. And here it is, the field of blood, Judas's death in the tomb of Annas. This is from Matthew 27. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. Judas threw the money into the temple, went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That it is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Now, where is the field of blood? Here is an aerial drawing of Jerusalem. You got the Pool of Bethesda up there just north of the Temple Mount, the Pool of Siloam. Those have been discovered. In fact, the Pool of Siloam was discovered by Israeli archaeologist Eli Shukran, who is always our guide when we go on an Israel trip. He's great. Just to the south of that area, though, is the tomb of Annas and the field of blood. This is in the area where Solomon was burning his own offspring to Molech. This is Gehenna, this place that Jesus referred to as hell, a metaphor for hell. And what did they discover there? They discovered the tomb of Annas. Now, how do we know it's the tomb of Annas? Because Josephus writes exactly where Annas's tomb was. And this is what they found inside. His tomb is in the middle. Can you see what's on top of that? That is a etching into the wall there of what the temple looked like. He was a high priest to the temple. Mm. And so they etched in the wall what the temple looked like. This is the only depiction we have of the temple. It's in Annas's tomb. And this tomb had a view of the Temple Mount, which would make sense. In fact, the biblical significance of this, by the way, was discovered by the Rittmeyers in 1994, is that it's consistent with the biblical record of Annas being the former high priest included in Jesus's trial. He's the father-in-law to Caiaphas, as we mentioned. And the site is called the Field of Blood, which corroborates the biblical account of Judas after the arrest. Now, interestingly enough, who sold Joseph into slavery in the Old Testament? Anyone know who that was?
Manasseh.
Nope.
His brothers.
Which brother? Which brother instigated it?
Simeon?
Judah.
Judah.
Who's Judah? Judah's in the bloodline of the Messiah.
Yeah.
He's the namesake of the southern kingdom. He's the 4th son of Jacob. And he sold Joseph to the Egyptians in Shechem. Was it 20 pieces of silver or 30? I can't remember.
Wasn't it 30?
It may have been 30. Okay. Do you know how the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament completed in about 250 BC, how does it translate the word Judah? It translates the word Judah or the name Judah as Judas.
Huh.
Wow. Amazing.
It's a tapestry. There's a divine hand behind this. Nobody could have contrived this. So Jesus is betrayed by Judas. Joseph is betrayed by Judah, also called Judas. And Judah is in the bloodline of the Messiah. So now you've got 7 biblical names from Jesus's trial and crucifixion confirmed by archaeology. This is why even atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman will say there's no doubt Jesus was crucified. You know, who are the only people in the world that deny Jesus was crucified?
Muslims?
Yeah, the Muslims. Why?
Yeah.
The Muslims, because the Quran says in Surah 4 that he didn't die, he was taken straight to heaven, and somebody was substituted for Jesus on the cross. The only people that deny it are the people that come up with a story 600 years later and are bound to believe that story, even though it's not an eyewitness account. So Jews believe he was crucified, atheists believe he was crucified, Christians believe he was crucified. It's only the Muslims, for religious reasons, that say Jesus was not crucified. So how about the empty tomb? Is there any evidence for the empty tomb? Archaeologically, which would kind of be hard to get, right? Well, first of all, where was the tomb? It was, by just about every archaeologist's opinion, out there now in what is known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the archaeological work that has been done there is very strong. I know the Garden Tomb looks better. I know you want it to be the Garden Tomb, but it's not the Garden Tomb. Okay. This is where Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. And it's in this area here, as we mentioned earlier. Okay. Now you can see in this graphic here, the dotted wall is the modern wall of the ancient city of Jerusalem. But in Jesus's day, Golgotha, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now, that was outside the city walls. And you could see how Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, coming in from the left of this toward the Praetorium, could be conscripted to carry his cross still outside the city walls. Again, same graphic that we mentioned earlier. Jesus is going to Golgotha, which was outside the city walls and was an ancient quarry where there would have been a tomb, and a tomb that probably looked like this. There is actually a tomb just like this. When we go to Israel now, we don't go to the Garden Tomb anymore. Of course, we have to go to the Church of Holy Sepulchre. Everybody wants to see it, but it's a madhouse for those of you that have been there. We go to this tomb, which is right behind the city of, or the David Hotel. You guys know where the David Hotel is? King David
yes.
Hotel. Right behind this King David Hotel, just maybe 100 yards, is this first century tomb with this rollaway rock. And the tombs, we know archaeologically, were hewn from rock, and some had this large circular stone that you see here that could be rolled down a decline into the doorway. Expensive tombs could be solo or reserved for a family, and tombs like this were available only to the wealthy in Jerusalem, and Joseph of Arimathea was wealthy. So is this what we see at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? No, we see this. right? Which is this, I think they call this thing a euticle. It's built over the tomb inside a bigger structure, which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So when you go in there, you're like totally disoriented. How can this be the place where Jesus was buried and allegedly rose from the dead? It looks just like a mass of commercialization, and it is. But nobody would forget where the place was. Hadrian actually marked this place, so when Helena came back, everybody knew where the place was. That's why they kept building churches over this area. Churches are always built over these sites. But if you were to go into that tomb and, and able to go down in, they have done tests on it, and there is a tomb from the 1st century down there, a rock tomb. Here's what Titus Kennedy, an archaeologist, says. According to excavations, this tomb had a single short hallway passage from the entrance into a single square-shaped room where the body would lay. The architecture of the entrance suggests that a large circular stone had sealed the tomb, although similar tombs do exist that have square ceiling stones rather than round. The description of the tomb in the Gospels makes it clear that it was a single-chamber rock-cut tomb and that a round circular ceiling stone was used, which would agree with archaeological findings. So just about every archaeologist who's looked into this will tell you, yeah, this is where it happened. And the evidence fits it quite well. And Titus Kennedy has some great books. Here are 2 of them, Unearthing the Bible and Excavating the Evidence for Jesus. So most of the work that we did to pull these 22 one-hour lessons together came from either Titus Kennedy or Joel Kramer or a few other archaeologists I'll mention later. There are some good Christian archaeologists out there, but there are a lot of people out there who don't think much in the Bible is true. They're called minimalists. But I would argue that if they were to look at the data objectively, they would discover that there is a lot of evidence that the Bible, the events, the people, the places in the Bible are all true.
Dr. Frank, we're going to take some questions the last 45 minutes. Please continue what you're doing. There's someone who's asking about Golgotha, if it's the same site as the Holy Sepulchre where the tomb is, and how far from Golgotha is the tomb?
It is the tomb. Oh, it's just all of it's contained under one church. Okay, so it's just yards away. So the traditional site of the crucifixion, if you go in the Holy Sepulchre, you go up these steps, and up in these steps, they think that's where the cross was. If you were to walk down, I'd probably say 150 feet, maybe 50 yards, you'd be where the tomb is. So it's not far.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Nazareth. This is overlooking the Valley of Armageddon, actually, the Jezreel Valley. And this is the cliff that they probably were about to throw Jesus off in Luke chapter 4 when he inaugurated himself as the Messiah. And they didn't really like that. In any event, there's been a decree studied or discovered there. And this is known as enemy attestation for an empty tomb. And let's read from Matthew 28. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. Before I go any further, this is a bad explanation for at least a couple of reasons. Number one, if a Roman guard fell asleep on duty, what would happen to him?
He'd be executed.
Yeah. And number two, if he was asleep, how would he know what happened? Right? How could you say, well, you see, we were sleeping, and while we were sleeping, we noticed that the disciples came down here and stole the body. No, you wouldn't know that if you were sleeping. So the whole thing is really contrived. And then, of course, what motive would they have to steal the body? That makes no sense either. Anyway, so the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and the story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Now, why is that last sentence important? Well, because who is Matthew writing to? Who's he trying to convince?
Yeah, he had a Jewish audience.
Right. Matthew has a Jewish audience, so he's trying to convince the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, how much credibility would he have with the Jews if he was trying to tell them that their story was that the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep, if that really wasn't what they were saying? He would have discredited himself completely with the Jews. That must therefore have been the story that the Jews were circulating, that the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Otherwise, Matthew's losing all credibility by saying, I know what your explanation is. Here it is. If it wasn't their explanation, he'd go, Matthew, that's not our explanation. You're lying. So this must have been the story. And there is an ancient Jewish source which says the same thing, that, yeah, the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Now, what has been discovered? This 2 feet by like 1.5 foot Greek inscription was acquired in Nazareth in 1878, but it came to light in 1925. This is called the Nazareth inscription. It's an edict of Caesar made between 41 and 54 AD against disturbing graves or tombs. It's not about robbing graves, which was a civil offense, but about removing bodies from graves, which the edict declares is now a capital offense, from Emperor Claudius, but posted locally by King Herod Agrippa I, who was the grandson of Herod the Great, who killed James, the brother of John, and imprisoned Peter. In other words, this edict comes down from Caesar, but Herod Agrippa I, being a loyal subject, says, I'm going to post this here in Nazareth. Now, why would anybody say that robbing a grave and taking a body out of it is a capital offense within 10 years of Jesus's alleged resurrection? Seems to me this would be overkill if it were just about grave robbing. Instead, it likely reflects opponents' response to Jesus's resurrection, because they were accusing the disciples of stealing the body. This certainly seems like enemy attestation that Jesus's tomb was empty. If so, it shows the church was teaching the resurrection very early, and Rome was struggling to combat that belief. In fact, one scholar puts it this way: the Nazareth inscription only fits a Jewish context, since only the Jews buried their dead in rolling stone tombs from which bodies could be easily taken. It does not prove that Jesus rose from the dead. What it does prove is that the story of Christ's resurrection was already well known, even to the Emperor Claudius, less than 10 years after the crucifixion. Modern people thus must decide, did Jesus actually rise from the dead, or did his apostles perpetrate a fraud by faking his resurrection? I believe that he rose from the dead. Why would you perpetrate a fraud anyway? To get yourselves beaten, tortured, and killed? That doesn't make any sense. So the Christians are teaching resurrection early. The Romans know about it, and the Romans want to prevent any future incidents like this, so they make robbing a grave of a body a capital offense. Unlikely if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead. What about the resurrection? What evidence do we have for that? Archaeologically, go back to, and this story has been widely circulated to this day. That's from Matthew 28. Let's keep reading. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. All right, we got to stop right here. This is something known as embarrassing testimony that wouldn't have been invented. This is what historians use when they're trying to discover whether someone's telling the truth. It's called the principle of embarrassment. It goes like this: if there's something embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true.
Mm-hmm, true. Yeah.
You're not going to invent things that make you look bad, right? You might invent things that make you look good, but you're not going to invent things that embarrass you. Who would ever say that the disciples were doubting with the resurrected Jesus giving them the Great Commission right in front of them? Nobody's going to say this. Of course, nobody's going to say 100 other things that are embarrassing, like Peter's called Satan by Jesus. Peter says, Lord, I'll never deny you. He denies him 3 times. They all run away for fear of the Jews. And the women are the brave ones to discover the empty tomb when women's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. These are too embarrassing. They would never say Jesus was a madman, demon possessed. They would never have his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute. They would never say there are 2 prostitutes in Jesus's bloodline, Rahab and Tamar. Nobody's making this up. They wouldn't say his brothers didn't believe in him or his family thought he was out of his mind in Mark chapter 3. This is not an invented storyline. They're telling the truth. In fact, Dennis Prager, the conservative Jewish radio host, says, one of the reasons I know that the Old Testament is true is because no people group would invent such an embarrassing history of themselves.
Yeah.
And I agree with Dennis Prager, but I would ask Dennis, if embarrassing testimony authenticates the Old Testament, why doesn't it authenticate the New? Because there's a lot of embarrassing stuff in the New Testament as well. And by the way, just since we're in a political season, just compare that to, say, the press secretary for the president. I don't care who's in the office of the presidency. That press secretary is a spin master. That press secretary never admits anything's wrong. That press secretary is always trying to put a positive spin on everything. You don't find that in the Bible. They don't try to hide the embarrassing stuff in the Bible. It's just admitted. You don't even find embarrassing stuff in ancient history. You find exaggerations. You find pharaohs claiming they wiped Israel off the map when they did no such thing. They brag about stuff that didn't happen. They exaggerate everything. The Bible goes in the opposite direction. The Bible writers say, man, we blew it. We're being judged. We did stupid stuff. So, embarrassing testimony for me is one of the more persuasive pieces of evidence that the New Testament and even the Old Testament writers are telling the truth. There's certainly evidence for belief in the resurrection. This is Lachish, a very important site in ancient Israel. This was probably the second most important site other than Jerusalem in ancient Israel. It was a fortified city. It was overrun by Sennacherib in about 701 BC, and he overtook a number of other cities. He was an Assyrian dictator, and he was the guy that went to Jerusalem, and when he got back to Assyria, put on what is now known as the Taylor Prism a brag that he had Hezekiah caged like a bird. Doesn't say that he took Jerusalem, though. The only city that the Assyrians could never conquer was Jerusalem. But he tried to brag that he had Hezekiah caged like a bird. Why couldn't he take Jerusalem? Well, the Assyrians don't explain. But the Bible says that the angel of the Lord slayed 185,000 of their soldiers. And Hezekiah was saved, and Sennacherib went home with his tail between his legs. And then when he got back home, he was actually killed by one of his sons. And if you go to the reliefs that were originally discovered in what is now modern day Iraq, but are now in the British Museum, you see Sennacherib's face etched out. And it's actually a relief of Sennacherib taking out Lachish. But his face is etched out. Why? Well, one way to erase somebody from your memory is to etch out their face. And when you come home with 185,000 fewer soldiers, the people aren't going to like you very much. And so that's one theory as to why he was etched out. Anyway, not far from Lachish is a inscription related to Jesus. And this is archaeologist Joel Kramer, who has a short video on it. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear the video. Let me see if I can play it. You tell me if you can hear it.
Frank?
Yes, we can hear it.
Okay, watch this.
East of Lachish, in this area is an archaeological site called Beit Loya. And within the ruins themselves and in the surrounding hills are many, many caves. And it's in one of these caves that has a fig tree growing out of it. You actually have to climb through the leaves of this fig tree to get down into the cave, where you can see on the side of this limestone wall this huge Greek inscription. In fact, there's a shot of me walking between the camera and the inscription that shows you just how big this inscription is. Fortunately, this inscription has been published. It starts with a simple cross, a very early version of the cross, followed by two Greek words, all of them in uppercase Greek letters. First word is a name. It's translated Jesus. Second Greek word is translated present. So this inscription is translated Jesus is present. There's another cross, a fancier cross, underneath the inscription that is believed to have been added later. The inscription dates to the end of the 2nd century AD, or maybe into the beginning of the 3rd century AD. So we're talking about the late 100s to early 200s AD. Very early inscription. It is very least one of the earliest inscriptions mentioning Jesus, possibly oldest inscription mentioning Jesus. So now, why is this inscription underground in a cave? Because it dates to the time period when there was intense persecution by the Romans against Christians. So the church often met literally underground, as they did in this cave. How do we know that the Jesus in the inscription is the Jesus of the New Testament? Well, it's the symbol of the crosses in this inscription.
Joel has a lot more on his website, some really great videos, but there's the inscription right there. So go to his website. You'll see a lot more. Let's do one more piece of evidence. This actually comes from Rome. And this is a famous inscription, by the way. Notice that those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law and elders mocked him. And of course, Paul said this: "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom." But people mocked Christians and still do. Well, on one hill, Palatine Hill in Rome, there's been an ancient discovery. It was discovered actually in 1857, where they found this graffiti scratching the plaster of a school. And it depicts a Roman crucifixion with a man raising his hand toward the victim who has a donkey head. The writing says, "Alexamenos worships his God." And this is likely referring to Jesus's crucifixion and the belief that he was God. So there's the real inscription on the right. On the left is just an outline of it, so you can see. This is a mocking piece of graffiti on this young man worshiping his God. This comes from, I think, the early 2nd century. And it's obviously spread as far as Rome. Of course, Paul's writing the book of Romans in about 57 AD. Christianity by 100 AD, the first, say, 70 years of Christianity, had churches all over the ancient world. How do you explain that if there was no resurrection?
Mm-hmm.
So this is just the archaeological evidence. Obviously, there's a lot more evidence we could bring to bear if we were allowed to look at writings and allowed to look at the impact of Christianity in the 1st century. But this is just archaeology. This is the earliest depiction of Roman crucifixion in the 1st or 2nd centuries. It's consistent with the biblical details about how Jesus was mocked by Roman and religious leaders alike for being crucified, and its enemy attestation confirming that belief in Christ's crucifixion and resurrection had spread to Rome. I mean, why worship a mocked and crucified Jesus if resurrection did not happen? It wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, enemy attestation is just very powerful because it shows that what is being said is probably true. You know, if your mother says you're brave, okay, maybe it's mom. But if your arch enemy says you're brave, yeah, you're brave. Because your arch enemy is giving you a compliment, which typically doesn't happen, right? All right, so what do we have? From the crucifixion, there's 7 biblical people involved in crucifixion that we've discovered in the dirt. We also have the field of blood, which is Annas and Judas. From the empty tomb, we have the known location with the right tomb. We have the Nazareth decree against removing the body. And we have the Jesus is present inscription regarding the resurrection and the mocking graffiti of worship in Rome. One last thing about this. When Pilate had Jesus before him, and he asked the Jews, what should I do with the king of the Jews? What did they, of course, say? Yeah, they said, crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has this guy committed? Asked Pilate. And they just shouted all the louder, crucify him. Now, here is the key phrase, especially for campus ministry or for any ministry in the 21st century. Pilate does something that we have to avoid doing. Here it is. Wanting to satisfy the crowd.
Yep.
Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and he had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. He wanted to satisfy the crowd, and too often that's what we want to do. We don't want to talk about the hard issues. We don't want to talk about, LGBTQ. We don't want to talk about critical theory. We don't want to talk about Jesus being the only way. We don't, we want to shy away. We can't do that. We've got to show people the truth and how our worldview is the truth, and they can know it's the truth and be saved. But don't try and satisfy the crowd.
Good. Good.
Because if you try and do that, you're not going to be preaching the word anyway. What's the point? By the way, I don't know what you guys think of this, but I think this is one of the major problems that we have in American Christianity today is most of us think the church is for unbelievers. And we orient our services for unbelievers, which means we never talk about the hard stuff. This is why pastors don't talk about the obvious evils that are going on in our society related to the election. You've got one candidate that wants not only abortion up to the moment of conception, moment of birth, she wants the government to pay for it.
Terrible.
And you've got pastors not talking about it because they don't want to upset anyone. They don't want to be divisive. Ladies and gentlemen, if someone walks into your church as an unbeliever and you say that child dismemberment is wrong and they leave, they wouldn't agree with you got to be born again anyway if they don't think child dismemberment's wrong. I mean, your job is to do what's right and leave the results to God, not to tickle the ears of people to, as Paul says, these people in the last days are going to put teachers around them that are going to tell them what their itching ears want to hear. Well, you're not preaching God's word when you do that. You're preaching your own. You're preaching the culture.
Right.
I mean, why even go to church? If church is just going to be another version of CNN or MSNBC, what's the point? Just stay home and watch that. Okay. Anyway.
Frank,
Good preaching, Frank.
Let me just mention one other thing.
Amen.
I'm not an archaeologist, but I know people who are. Okay. And these are the people that I know and have read. I know all these guys. I don't know Scott Stripling, but I know of him. If you want to get good reading in archaeology, check out Titus Kennedy. His books are easy to understand. They don't go into a whole bunch of depth, just enough so you know what you're talking about. Joel Kramer has the best videos on this kind of stuff. He goes to these locations and he actually puts drones up. In fact, I had him on the podcast once, and he was talking about Babylon, and he was in Babylon, and he's obviously got a drone up. And I said, "How did you get a drone up over Babylon?" He said, "I better not say any more." Okay, so So check his Expedition Bible site out. Randall Price for years taught at Liberty University. Scott Stripling is the guy that just discovered that curse tablet on Joshua's altar in Mount Ebal, you may have heard about a couple of years ago. Bryant Wood is an older guy now, but Bryant Wood has done some great analysis of Jericho. John Currid has a great book on archaeology. He's actually a pastor here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Craig Evans is another guy that has written a lot on archaeology. The Associates for Biblical Research, those guys are all Bible-believing Christians. The Armstrong Institute, I don't know if they're all Bible-believing Christians, but they come out of, used to be a cult, but they've gotten away from their cultish beliefs. But they do some good work in the Old Testament, and they're over there in Jerusalem. So you can see videos from them and podcasts from them.
Yeah, that
So-
was Ted. That was Ted Armstrong, wasn't it? Years ago.
Garner Ted Armstrong.
Yeah, they came out of him, but they were one of the few kind of cults that actually became Orthodox again.
Because the Fuller Seminary folks reached out to him and helped them correct their doctrine, and they repented.
Mhm. There you go.
Yeah,
All right.
I was there at Fuller watching the whole thing unfold. It was amazing. It was supernatural. About 30% of everybody that was in the cult converted to Orthodox Christianity. So it was pretty
Nice.
amazing. Yeah.
Nice. But, even if they are a cult, it doesn't mean their archaeology is wrong.
Correct.
Okay. So, you've got to evaluate what the kind of work they're doing. But any of these gentlemen would be good. There's probably some more I have on my shelf. There's also a book that this is a really good book that I got at the British Museum. Evidence for the Bible. I think you could probably get it on Amazon too. These are two British guys that go through everything in the British Museum and talk about the biblical significance of those findings there. So
What's the Frank? What's the author's name of that book? Evidence for the Bible. Author.
that is Clive Anderson and Brian Edwards. Clive Anderson and Brian Edwards.
Dr. Frank, and just in the light of this, several of these guys will be out on the internet, and mostly college students will be out on the internet looking for different answers to questions that they have.
Mm-hmm.
You've given us trusted resources here and even clarified where the Armstrong Institute would be. But are there other resources that are out there on the internet that are presenting things on Instagram, et cetera, that we would be wary of, should be wary of? And there's a lot of stuff talking about Ron Wyatt and all those different discoveries.
Oh yeah. Well, Ron Wyatt was probably the first guy in modern times to identify Jabal el-Lawz as being probably the real Mount Sinai, and he was probably right about that. In fact, we're going there in December. We're going on an Egypt, Saudi Arabia trip, but not everything Ron Wyatt said was correct. He just happened to sneak his way into Saudi Arabia in the mid 80s. And then my friend Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams did as well. But now others have been there, and it does appear to be it does appear to fit what the real Mount Sinai is. But yeah, Ron Wyatt was not a real archaeologist. But you notice that the top archaeological discoveries are normally found by non-archaeologists. I don't know if you know that, but they're just everyday people that stumble across, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was discovered by some Muslim shepherd kid who threw a rock into a cave trying to get one of his goats to come back to him. And he heard a clink, and before you know it, the greatest archaeological discovery related to the Bible and history was discovered. So
Any other concerns that you would help these college students and campus ministers and art apologists to be warned about or hold at abeyance?
you mean in archaeology?
Yes, in archaeology, as they go out on the internet and they look at Ron Wyatt and him getting the blood of Jesus at the bottom. And
Yeah, that's all hokey stuff. Come on. Yeah, Ron Wyatt, I wouldn't trust.
okay, anybody else that you can help to clarify for college students and
well, there are minimalists out there like Bill Deaver. You're not going to want to trust much from Bill Deaver. Okay. even though he's an archaeologist, he may get some things right, but he's a minimalist. He doesn't think much in the Bible's true, even though there's evidence staring at him in the face that it is. So I wouldn't trust him. You're going to hear a lot about Kathleen Kenyon. Kathleen Kenyon got Jericho all wrong when John Garstang had it right. And unfortunately, Kathleen Kenyon's view has won the day for many, but it's quite obvious she's wrong about Jericho. Jericho was destroyed about 1400 BC, just like the Bible says. And her mistake was she didn't find a certain kind of pottery that she expected to find if it was destroyed at that time. The problem was she didn't look into Garstang's work, who had found that pottery. Garstang had excavated Jericho about 20 years prior to her. So I wouldn't trust Kathleen Kenyon on her conclusions at Jericho. You can watch the video that Joel Kramer did on Jericho. And as Joel puts it, look, as soon as they discovered that the walls fell straight down, that should have been it. Bible had it right. How did the Bible have it right? How did it know that the walls fell straight down? We've never had a archaeological discovery of a city in history where the walls fell straight down. Why did it happen at Jericho? You know, normally when you take over a city, you batter the walls down. You know, you crash them in. You don't find that at Jericho. They just came down. How? Why?
Any
Huh?
other trumpets you'd like to blow concerning one particular person was mentioned on the chat is Billy Carson. I don't know anything about him, but any other trumpets you'd want to blow about Billy or others?
Don't know about Billy, so I can't blow a trumpet there.
Anyone else that you'd help?
No. Those are the, I mean, I prefer to just give you people you can trust. Here they are.
All right.
Right.
All right, let's
Leo,
open it up to questions now, Frank. If you don't mind, we have Amari, who's a graduate student from the University of Illinois,
Good.
Campaign Urbana, and we have other students that are online here, as well as campus missionaries, campus church planter up at Bucknell University with Matt Yancey, campus missionaries that are on Rice Brooks's God's Not Dead team, Addison Tweedy, and
I know
myself,
Addison. Yeah.
as well as Jace Napka, the videographer, Dave Polis, a pastor out in
Los Angeles.
I should say Los Angeles, Northridge. And so, and then of course you've got Aaron and Joe. Joe is a church planter on the college campus at North Carolina State University.
Oh, good.
And so there's a few other people on here I don't know how to introduce, but we're going to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. I think Pastor Dave just raised his hand. So Dave.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
So honored to have you with us, Dr. Frank. Appreciate it. I'm a good friend of Dr. Rice Brooks. I know you guys are good buddies as well.
Oh, yeah.
So anyways, I actually drove you to the airport years ago when you came in town. Me and you were all together.
Where were we? Where did we go?
Los Angeles. We were in Los Angeles. Yeah. Anyways, you obviously speak on the campus a lot. And since really we focus a lot of our energies on the campus, can you share with us just kind of like a life hack of what you think works best with the students today? I know we've talked about, evidence for, Jesus's death at the empty tomb and the resurrection. What other things in addition to this have you seen that really affect people and cause them for their hearts to be opened to the gospel?
Well, the top three objections to Christianity now are morality, morality, and morality. Okay. Everybody wants to have their own morality and get to do what they want to do when they want to do it. That's why I always ask them, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And if they're honest, most of the time they'll say no. It's not a head problem, it's a heart problem. They don't want it to be true, right? They want to do their own thing. So you should always ask them, hey, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? See what they're saying, see what they're doing. Because it's hard now to be a Christian. 50 years ago, it was easy. Everybody was, right? Everybody had kind of a moral consensus. Now, Christianity doesn't agree with LGBTQ. It can't be right. It's got to be wrong now. Christianity, you guys are colonialists. Whoo, that can't be right. You're oppressors. That can't be right. Isn't it quite odd that you're seeing people on college campuses actually protesting for the new Nazi party, Hamas. You look at their charter. They even say in their charter, no, all these land deals are a vain waste of time. They don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. No Israel. Their job
Yeah.
is to kill Jews. Their focus and marching orders come from the Quran. And yet you still have politicians talking about Kamala Harris just the other night talking about there is no two-state solution. They don't want it. They want to kill Jews. And why would you have people who are LGBTQ wanting to side with Hamas? Because the first people that would be thrown off a building if they went to Gaza would be the LGBTQ people.
Correct.
Why are they siding with Hamas? I'll tell you why they're siding with Hamas, because they buy into the oppressor-oppressed Marxist bifurcation, that anybody who is in the oppressed category is always right, and anybody in the oppressor category is always wrong, regardless of behavior. So if Christians are always oppressors, that means Muslims are always oppressed. If Jews are oppressors, Muslims are oppressed. If heterosexuals are oppressors, LGBTQ, they're being oppressed. So the oppressed people always need to stick together, even though they might kill one another when they get one of those presents, right? I mean, that's the woke mind virus going around, that people can't make these basic moral distinctions. The other aspect to this is that anybody who is oppressed morally can never be wrong, which is why you have people on campus essentially saying that people that come across the border and murder and rape children were justified. Sorry, I just have to call that out when I see it.
Amen.
So let me just
I
follow
really
up.
appreciate you. I really appreciate you being clear about this, Frank. You give us articulation. And of course, as Ms. Peacock says, he who defines wins. And so you're helping to give us clear definition of how to think about these oppressor bifurcation of the Marxist ideology that's infiltrating college campuses. David, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, so you're saying, because a lot of apologists I've heard in the past, they try to shy away from anything that's at the intersection of apologetics and politics. What you're saying is we should hit the morality aspect pretty much so head on.
Why not? Look,
I don't disagree with you. I'm just,
yeah.
I like your angle.
I would just ask people, what area of your life does Jesus not reign over?
Right.
You camera.
I mean, you're supposed to be a Christian, not just at church, not just at home, not just at work, not just at play, not just online, but what you do in the voting booth as well. How are those things different? I don't understand.
They're not.
You know,
I agree.
there was you guys know about Summit Ministries?
Yeah.
They're in Colorado. I teach there. A lot of people teach there. And there's somebody on hot mic right now. I don't know what's going on. Somebody on hot mic.
I have it on so that people can ask you questions. So David Noble is at Summit Ministries.
Yeah, well, David Noble started Summit Ministries. He's retired now. But probably 20 years ago, he had asked 400 students at Summit. He gave them a test. And he had all these different professions or activities listed, about 400 different professions and activities, you know, like baker, farmer, missionary, pastor, priest, salesman, you know, just a whole bunch of things. And he said, I want you to check one of two boxes. Is this a sacred or a secular activity? And he said out of 400 students, only 2 got 100% right. Only 2 said everything was sacred. We bought into this idea that there's something secular about life if you're a Christian, and nothing secular. Everything you do should be driven by your following of Jesus.
Yes. Excellent.
So,
Leah, Dr. Lawson, can I ask a question?
Yeah,
go
so
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Frank, thank you. Thank you so much. This is excellent. I just want to ask you a question, historically, going back to relics and, you know, things that have historical significance. Talk just for a moment about the the Shroud of Turin, how it plays into a historical relevant artifact.
The man that has researched that quite a bit is a friend of mine who is actually the top guy in the world on the resurrection. His name's Gary Habermas. I don't know if you know who Gary Habermas is. He just come out with this magnum opus, his first volume on the resurrection. It's up there on the shelf somewhere, and it's like 1,200 pages, one volume out of 4. I mean, he's a beast. He's been working on it for decades. Well, the first book, one of the first books he ever wrote, which is still a bestseller, probably his #1 bestseller, is called The Shroud. He wrote it like in 1980. Gary's like 73 now, maybe 74. Gary has studied it to a great extent. It's been in the news recently. I don't know if you saw, there's been another news article about it, about the dating. The dating is checking out to the 1st century. And if you were to ask Gary, how sure are you this is the burial cloth of Jesus? He said, I'm about 80% sure. Okay. Now, I don't talk about it much because it's speculative. And if it didn't exist, it wouldn't matter.
Exactly.
Right. There's much better evidence that Jesus rose from the dead than an unexplained piece of cloth. Right. But the more and more you look at the shroud, the more and more you realize this is an authentic burial cloth for someone from the 1st century. And how the image got imprinted there, nobody knows, because it's no technology that existed at the time could have done this. So could it be an evidence for the resurrection? Perhaps, but we don't know.
And no technology today could actually do the imprinting from what I've heard technologically could not even happen today.
That's right.
With all of the radioactive. Okay, so
my second question, Frank, is most of us on here have been in ministry for a long time. We deal with churches and college campus. And so if you had what I could say your 3 silver bullets in apologetics, what would they be?
Well, I'll just give you 2. God exists and Jesus rose from the dead.
Okay, yeah.
If those 2 things are true, Christianity's true.
Right.
Those are the only 2 points you need to prove. That God exists and Jesus rose from the dead. The next thing you need to talk about is, so what? Who cares? Okay. And one of the things that I've been saying lately at the end of every college presentation is that everybody you love will die. Everything you say will be forgotten. Everything you build will crumble. Everything you do will come to nothing. You and your identity will die and vanish unless the resurrection's true.
Good.
I mean, if there is no resurrection, what's the point?
Yeah.
What's going to be the point of any of this? In 50 years, everybody on this call will be dead. Well, maybe not Matt. Okay. In 60 years, everybody on this call will be dead.
Yeah. It should be total nihilism if there's no God.
Yeah. Then what? What's the point?
Good.
There is no point.
Frank, I'm going to come to a graduate student over here at the University of Illinois, Mari, see if he has any questions. I have one of the guys who's part of the Alliance of Campus Evangelists and Apologists was involved in a retreat and sent 9 questions. I'll select from them to share after Amari maybe gets a shot at it. But this video will be put up on our website, campusevangelist.org. And you'll be able to review this. Several of the people that asked me, can I get the video? Well, they can. It'll be up on our website. If you give me permission to put it on our Alliance of Campus Evangelists and Apologists website, campusevangelist.org.
Yeah, that's fine. This is actually going to be an online course, probably starting in February. We have, as I say, 22 sessions. I just showed you portions of one of those sessions in archaeology. So,
course for college credit or graduate level credit?
It's no, but you can get, if you want to go to Southern Evangelical Seminary, you can get some credit toward going there for these courses. These are on our website, crossexamine.org. Click on online courses. We have about 30 different courses up there.
Please tell a little bit about your ministry before I go to Amari and the resources that they can find, crossexamine.org, etc.
Well, we've got all those online courses I mentioned. It's not just me teaching them all. We have Gary Habermas, Mike Lacona, Lisa Childers, Jay Warner Wallace, other people teaching courses, Sean McDowell. But we also have a podcast. It's twice a week. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. Wherever you get podcasts, you can find it. Of course, we go to college campuses a lot. We were just at Arizona State Monday. Next week, we'll be at Western Carolina. The week after that, we're going to be at a couple colleges in Louisiana. We'll also be at LSU a couple weeks after that. So we do a lot of college campus works. We do I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on campus. They're all streamed live on our YouTube channel, and they stay up there. That's where you see all those Q&As that come on our YouTube channel. They're just cut from those longer events. We have a TV show on DirecTV. It's also the NRB network that you can watch streaming on our website. Of course, the standard stuff, all the standard social media sites, and
Nearly
we have-
200, nearly 200 radio stations as well.
yeah, we're on the radio, but that doesn't matter. If it's podcasted, people listen to it on the podcast, you know.
So Frank, just first of all, I want to say that we on the God's Not Dead team here with Dr. Rice Brooks, going from campus to campus, we so appreciate the commitment that you have to get to the campuses. I know you're a former, naval officer, and as a result, you come ready for the battle. And we certainly appreciate the heart that you have, the love that you show, the compassion I saw at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, after that shooting. And so appreciate you and your ministry, and thank you for taking time to equip these evangelists in campus ministry and students like Amari. So Amari, you get your shot, brother. Go ahead.
So first of all, Dr. Turek, thank you for your awesome presentation, and also thank you to Dr. Lawson for sending me the link.
No, thanks, Amar.
So I had a couple of questions, but I guess I'll pick the one that I'm most interested in, with the Nazareth inscription.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned how it corroborates the resurrection. My question was, if memory serves, that there's a scripture where it mentions that other people rose from the dead at the same time around Jesus's resurrection or death. So my question was, would that edict also maybe corroborate that as well? I guess if it's not just one person who's in Herod's mind, I guess, supposedly risen from the dead, would this corroborate the other people who are also claimed to have risen from the dead?
Well, I suppose it could. The problem is when Matthew just makes that offhanded reference to the saints came out of the tomb and walked around, he doesn't say anything else about that. And it doesn't seem like that was nobody tried to explain that event away by saying, someone stole the bodies. So it probably doesn't have that in mind, if that was even known, because Matthew doesn't talk about it very much. He just mentions it in an offhanded way. Also, there's a difference between a resuscitation and a resurrection. Technically, somebody like Lazarus was just resuscitated. Yes, he was dead, but he died again, right? A resurrection to a new body, which is what Jesus had, would never die again. Just like when we're ultimately resurrected, we'll get the glorified, immortal, imperishable body. So Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, meaning the kind of body that he had will ultimately have. So probably the Nazareth inscription, though, has in mind Jesus because of the global impact at that point that event had. But it was trying to be suppressed by both the Romans and the Jews. By the way, what would have been the easiest way to nullify Christianity immediately? If it was false.
If they found a body.
Yeah, just go to the tomb. They knew where the tomb was. Go to the tomb, take the body out. Why didn't they do that? In fact, the Jewish explanation is actually admitting the tomb was empty. You don't need to come up with an explanation for an empty tomb if his body's still in there. So the very fact that they're coming up with this explanation and Matthew is recording it and writing to the very people that came up with the explanation shows the tomb must have been empty. Otherwise, this would make zero sense at all.
And when the wax was put on the road, the stone was rolled, and then the wax had the insignia put on there. It was at the price of their life if they opened that stone.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
I didn't know if you had mentioned that or not.
Yeah, well, certainly after the Nazareth decree, that was true. Right? You didn't want to be messing with tombs at all. Go ahead, Aaron.
Frank, one of our young campus missionaries, Jace, He's got a question for you. So, Jace, you want to ask? Go ahead, Jace.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Jace.
yeah, thank you so much for speaking today. I just want to ask, in your opinion, what's the most compelling extra biblical, I guess, evidence of the crucifixion and resurrection?
Wow. Most compelling extra biblical evidence for the crucifixion and resurrection. Well, we got those 7 people, right? Let me think through that. I would say that's a hard one. You know, the Nazareth inscription is quite good. That early archaeological discovery about Jesus being present, that the little video I showed, that's quite good. You know, I guess it's kind of just a matter of opinion, what is most persuasive. But the most persuasive argument for me is that it's not necessarily archaeology. It's the fact that these people who were in a position to know whether Jesus had risen from the dead or not died excruciating deaths when they could have saved themselves by simply saying it never happened. They had no motive to invent this. They had every motive to say it didn't happen, because by saying it did happen, they got kicked out of the synagogue and then beaten, tortured, and killed. So the most persuasive evidence for me is not anything you find in the dirt. The most persuasive evidence for me is the fact that these Jews had no motive to invent this and yet said it happened and went to their deaths. I mean, there are 2 things Jews didn't believe in the first century. They didn't believe you could claim to be God. That was blasphemy. And they didn't believe someone would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They knew we'd rise from the dead at the end of time because Isaiah and Daniel talk about that. But they didn't think one guy would rise from the dead. Yet here they are saying that, yeah, a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead. And then they abandon their ancient practices and suddenly follow this itinerant preacher and go to their deaths for an empirical claim, not a spiritual claim, an empirical claim, right? Like, the tomb's empty. He's risen. Yeah. In fact, I often tell audiences this. I say, Christianity's not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. People go, well, what do you mean? Because I point out to them, do you realize that there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? Yeah, why? Because they didn't read about it in a book. They witnessed the resurrected Jesus. They saw Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. Yeah, some people today, like Muslims, they'll die for a lie they think is the truth, but nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. So, you know, Christianity did not begin with a book. It began with an event. There would be no book or series of books we put under one binding we call the New Testament, written by Jews in the first century, that claimed a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead, unless a man really did claim to be God and rose from the dead. Why would they do this? It makes zero sense. This is why when people say, do you have any non-Christian writers to talk? Yeah, we got them, but why are you even asking that? I mean, the people that had the most to lose said it happened. You know, they get this idea that you can only trust non-Christian writers. The reverse is true. The non-Christian writers had no interest in this. It was the people that had their lives turned upside down and changed their worldview because they saw Jesus had risen from the dead and then were beaten, tortured, and killed because of it. They're not making this up. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, based on what you're saying, couldn't you leverage Paul's conversion and his life as, evidence, non-biblical, even though he did write a lot of the New Testament? Couldn't that be evidence?
Well, that's what that's the role that Gary Habermas, or the methodology Gary Habermas takes, called the minimal facts, where he says even atheistic scholars who study the New Testament evidence admit Number one, Jesus was crucified. Number two, his disciples believed he rose from the dead and had experiences that they thought he had risen from the dead. Number three, Saul was converted. Number four, James was converted. Some of them, most of them will still say, and the tomb was empty, right? The question is, how do you interpret these facts? They all agree on the facts, but how do you explain them? And that's why even atheists like Bart Ehrman today, given those facts, will not try and explain them because they can't explain them from a secular point of view. Any kind of naturalistic explanation they come up with is full of holes and they know it. Whether it's hallucinations, people don't have mass hallucinations, and the empty tomb would have, or if his body was in the tomb, they would have refuted him anyway. The swoon theory doesn't work. The twin theory doesn't work. There's no theory that works that explains the data. So yeah, you can just use minimal facts and say, look, everybody agrees on these minimal facts. How do you interpret them? What's the best explanation?
So, Dr. Frank, I'm going to ask if Addison Tweedy, we can't see his face right now, but
we don't want to see Addison's face. Trust me. I've seen it at Vanderbilt. Keep the camera off, Addison.
I'm going to give him a shot to ask whatever question. He's actually a protege for Rice and is traveling from campus to campus doing Rice's presentation when Rice can't. And
but he's still at Vanderbilt, right? Are you at Vanderbilt, Addison?
Go ahead, Addison.
No, I've been for the last 6 years. For the last 6 years, I've taken over the director role for guys at that event. So I help put those events on, make them happen. So
that's Rice's stunt double right down there.
I just been hiding my face because I just had a second jaw surgery. I have 5 plates and 27 screws in my jaw. So
what happened?
Well, I got in a doctoral debate with Leo, and we just had at it. No, I just was fixing my jaw, the teeth, and pretty intensive. Rice convinced me to do it, so I had the first one last year, and then the second one this year. So I got some, just recovering a little bit of swelling and stuff. But anyway,
easy for Rice to say, "Hey, why don't you do that? Why don't they break your jaw, smash your teeth in?
Exactly.
Yeah, go ahead."
He just figured he didn't want my smile getting in the way of the gospel. So he's like, go ahead and fix that thing. So, but no, I don't really have any questions. I'm just taking notes. I just jumped on today to get my mind back in that space because next week we'll start our first event of the semester. I'll be at the University of Virginia, then we'll be at Houston. So I'm just, I listen to you. What I love about you, Frank, is every time I turn you on, I hear the same thing. But it's like scripture because it's no trouble for me to remind you of these things. Like we know it's true. We have to constantly be reminded. As C.S. Lewis said, we have to dwell on them and be fed them, or mind drifts. So when I listen to you, it's like getting a wheel alignment in your car. You just want to, okay, let's get back and make sure we're heading in the right direction. So
well, as you know, we all get the same 20 questions over and over again. They're just phrased differently, right?
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you have an answer for this, but I did. I went to did an event last night at TSU, and I took Dr. Igor Sapkovitz with me. Dr. Igor's on here. I invited him. That's the little IPS, I think, on there, Igor Paul Sapkovitz. But I met him last year in Colorado Springs at an event and getting him to start working with us, with our team. But Igor, do you remember that question we had last night about she was asking about time and God? Are you still, let's see if Igor's still on here. Is he still? Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay. That question we had last night.
Yeah. So there was 2 questions that pertain to what you're referring to. One was the Big Bang and the idea of infinity. The other one was if God is infinite, how? Well, I guess the question was more about how is it possible that if real infinity does not exist allegedly in our universe, how is it possible that we will spend time in eternity, like in something that is true infinity, basically? That was an interesting question.
Yeah, maybe the questioner might be confusing infinity with time. God is outside of time, and space, time, and matter had a beginning, as even the atheists will admit. And if space, time, and matter had a beginning, what could have caused space, time, and matter? Only something that transcends space, time, and matter, something outside of space, time, and matter. So the cause of space, time, and matter, it seems to me, must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, because an impersonal force doesn't make choices, but someone had to make a choice to choose to create, Also, the being would have to be intelligent to have a mind to make a choice. And so you get at least 6 attributes of the first cause from what is known as the cosmological argument, right? You get a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent first cause. Now, people always ask, well, who made God? When then you point out, well, if God is timeless, if he's outside of time, which is what the evidence seems to show, then if you're outside of time, do you have a beginning? No, which means you don't have a cause. You're the uncaused first cause. So if you're the uncaused first cause, you don't have a beginning. Now, God is outside of time. He didn't have a beginning. He won't have an end. We're inside of time. We have a beginning, but we won't have an end. So we're not in the same realm in that regard. God is eternal. We have eternity, right? We're not eternal creatures by nature. We at one point didn't exist. God is eternal in his nature.
Yeah,
So,
I think
go
distinction
ahead.
that you made that I think Christians maybe don't think about right away, but that God is not necessarily or is not immanent, and we have to separate really the idea of creation and the idea of creator in 2 different realms. Yeah, as you said.
Yeah, well, when we say God is immanent, we mean his power is present everywhere, but his physicality isn't present anywhere because he's not a physical being, right? God is spirit. So it's not pantheism. It's not that God is in everything. It's that God's power is present everywhere and holds everything together. And this is exactly what Paul says and the writer of Hebrews. You know, in him we live and move and have our being. God holds all things together. The writer of Hebrews says God sustains all things by his powerful word. So God's power is present to his creation, holding it all together, keeping it going, but he is not the creation.
Exactly.
So, I mean, there are analogies you can use. You know, God is like a painter to a painting. You can see the painter's attributes in the painting, but the painter is not the painting, or the painting is not the painter. I think a better analogy is that God is to the universe what a band is to music, right? A band, when it's playing music, creates the music and sustains the music. What happens to the music the second the band stops playing? Music's over. Same thing is true with God. He creates the universe. He creates you. He creates the natural laws that keep it going. And he sustains the universe. He sustains you. He sustains the natural laws that keep it going. Like a band sustains music, God sustains his creation. But he's not the creation.
Yeah.
Just like a band isn't the music, right?
That's good. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Frank. Now I'm going to go over to Aaron. Aaron Wentz is the founder of the Michigan School of Apologetics and also the one who has given us use of his Zoom link today. And so I'm just going to see if he has any question. I know Matt is here, and then my Tabitris, who's at the retreat, gave me 9 questions. I'm going to ask those whenever we have a little break here. So Aaron, I'm going to give you a chance to ask all those questions. Aaron actually teaches an apologetics course to scores of Africans over the internet. And so they've led Muslims to the Lord as a result of his training. So Aaron, go ahead and ask any question that you've been holding in abeyance.
Yeah. Frank, you wrote your book in 2004. When you wrote this in 2004, I think you've already alluded to this, but what arguments do you think are just they've held up over time? You're ironclad about that. You're more certain now than you've ever been that these are effectual with people. And what things, when you first wrote this, have you kind of backed away from and said, you know, that's not really resonating with people?
We're updating the book right now, but I'm finding I'm not changing much. I'm adding and saying things maybe a little bit differently because there's new information that's come out. If anything, the evidence is stronger now, especially from the world of science. You know, there's been so much discovered since 2004, particularly in biology, believe it or not, that even affirms an intelligent designer more so. So it's not, there's nothing that I've come across where I go, well, that's wrong. Things have changed with approach from atheists. Atheists are fond of saying things like, well, they say this now, well, you know, I just lack a belief in God, which is really a stupid kind of way of saying you're an atheist, because the way to easily refute that is to say, let me just give you a proposition. God exists. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? Or don't you know? If you agree with that, you're a theist. If you disagree with that, you're an atheist. If you don't know, you're an agnostic. This is simple. Okay. If you're just going to say, I lack a belief in God, you're not saying anything about God at all. You're just saying something about your psychology. Well, if I say I lack a belief in evolution, am I giving an argument against evolution? No, I'm not saying anything about whether evolution is true or not. I'm just telling you about my psychology. So that is something the atheists have started to say since 2004 that I'll address in the update. But look, Dr. Geisler came up with that basic outline probably 50 years ago. Okay. The logic doesn't change. How you support some of the arguments may change because there's new evidence, but the arguments are the same in reality. I mean, there's nothing I'd say, well, that doesn't work anymore. No, all the science still works. So, and all the philosophy still works.
I wanted to make a comment based on your comment that we're apologists. We're good at saying, always be ready to give an answer, but we're misquoting that verse. The beginning of that verse says, set apart Jesus as Lord. And that's, in our culture today, that's what we have to be really, as representatives of Christ, we have to come out and say, you know, I'm going to make Jesus Lord. That's prime first. That's, you know, that. And Frank, you've done it. When I watch your videos, I'm just really impressed. So keep up the good work, that you're uncompromising, and we're grateful for you.
Yeah, well, here's one thing that I think we all need to keep in mind when we're on campus, because we all do that kind of work. Because people will ask me, how come you never get mad at these kids? Because, you know, sometimes they're obnoxious. And I go, why would I get mad at a 22-year-old? Look, I'm 62. When I was 22, I didn't agree with my 62-year-old self. So why should I expect some kid to agree with me now? In fact, we ought to probably have that attitude with everybody. Why should you expect anybody to agree with you? You probably didn't agree with you, 20 years ago, right? Or whenever. You don't have all the same beliefs you had when you were in college. Why should you expect everybody to now agree with where you are right now? You shouldn't. This is why the Apostle Paul said, I was an insolent and arrogant man, but Christ showed mercy on me. He saved me. He's looking back with gratefulness that he was saved. And when somebody gets up to the microphone, I don't know what their history is. I don't know what their family life is like. I don't know what's happened in their life. I don't know what they've read, haven't read. Maybe I assume most of the people that get up to the microphone truly believe what they believe, and maybe they think they have good reasons for it, right? So you ought to just say, okay, everyone's in process. Let me see if I can just move this person a little bit closer to the truth or away from error. And that's kind of the attitude we have to have. Not, wow, how could you be such an idiot and believe that? Right?
So
most people believe what they believe because they think it's true.
Thank you, Frank, for with gentleness and reverence, you address those issues as Scripture says that we're to do. So thank you for not being caustic to those students.
Oh, no.
Revealing the love of God. Just like Dave Polis with his son pastors an on-campus church at Cal State Northridge University. Also, we have Matt, who is here, who's pastored for the last 2 years, an on-campus church at Bucknell University, where Tim Keller graduated from.
Mm-hmm.
And that started from a God's Not Dead event in April. By July, we had several scores of disciples that ended up starting that church on the campus, and it's been going on for 2 years, and we've set in overseers and deacons. And Matt is the pastor with his wife there with other overseers. But I'm going to give Matt an opportunity to go ahead and ask what he wants. And then our other church planter here at North Carolina State University, and Matt's 26, and Joe is plus 66, plus more. And I'll let him ask questions. So Matt, anything you want to ask at this time before we go to Chantal?
Yeah, thanks so
Hey,
much,
Matt.
Dr. Frank. I've really appreciated your work over the years, and it's really fun to hear you talking about this more personally here now. I was curious with the archaeological evidence you brought up around the field of blood. I know this is a place where guys like Bart Ehrman and other skeptics sometimes bring up objections because of the seeming discrepancy between Matthew 27 and Acts chapter 1 as far as, did Judas hang himself? Did he fall headlong and burst open? Did he buy the field? Did the priest buy the field? Curious what your response would be to that objection that skeptics bring up.
Well, this book, which is no longer by this title, was written by my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler. It's called When Critics Ask. There's also another, it's now called The Big Book of Bible Difficulties. This is a book you need to get if you want to deal with some of those issues. And the particular, the one you're talking about Judas, I remember Geisler and Howe talking about this, saying, well, actually both are true. Because if Judas hung himself, in order to get the body down, you couldn't touch a body that had been dead. You would just have to cut the rope. And if you cut the rope, if he's hanging over rocks, he's going to hit rocks and his bowels are going to burst out. Okay, so it's probably both. It's just told from a different perspective. But let's back up to 10,000 feet. Bart Ehrman thinks that if you find one discrepancy or one difference in the Bible, it folds like a house of cards, which is stupid. I'll give you an example. Do you know that eyewitnesses who survived the Titanic disagreed how the Titanic sank? Some eyewitnesses said it went down whole. Others said it broke in two and then went down. So I guess we can't believe that the Titanic sank then, huh? No, of course. What do they all agree on? The Titanic sank. They disagree on how it sank, but they all agree that it sank. The same thing is true with the resurrection. Everybody agrees there was a resurrection. They may allegedly disagree of who got to the tomb first, how many angels were there, you know, these kind of things, which is what you would expect if eyewitnesses were telling a story or an account, giving an account of the same event. They wouldn't have all the same details in there. They'd emphasize certain things and not others. And it seems to me that Bart Ehrman is missing the forest for the trees, that he's making mountains out of molehills. Even if he's right, let's say there is a discrepancy. Let's say that, you know, Luke in Acts had it wrong and Matthew had Judas right. Okay. Okay. What's your point? Oh, inerrancy is wrong. Well, depends on how you define inerrancy, right? Okay. Does that mean Jesus didn't rise from the dead? No, he still rose from the dead. Even if we have two conflicting accounts about how Judas hung himself. So I think those can be harmonized. I think that some of these things are just how people communicate. Like, for example, there's one, and it may also pertain to the second example you brought up about who bought the field or whatever. One of the Gospels says that the centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant. And another gospel says representatives of the centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant, right? And this is supposed to be some big contradiction. It's not a contradiction at all, right? If Matthew's just making the account simpler by saying the centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant, even though the centurion sent a messenger to ask Jesus to heal his servant, right? I mean, we do that all the time. If you know, if there's a negotiation in a political situation, you know, Putin asked Trump to do X, right? Even though Putin may have had his Secretary of State call our Secretary of State to do something, you're not going to fault a reporter for saying it was that the message originally came from Putin and it was going to Trump or Biden or whoever, right? It's really it's really making mountains out of molehills. The Bible communicates just like we communicate. It's not this technical document where everything has to be precisely, literally true. Does that
Good.
make sense?
So Matt, I'm going to give you a follow-up question if you wish, before we go to Joe.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks. This is a good response. I was curious, this is actually a clarifying question from earlier when you were talking about the lack of expectation in a Jewish mindset for there to be a singular resurrection of one person before the resurrection in the last day. So how does that relate with the priest going to Pilate on Saturday saying, hey, post a guard here because this deceiver said he's going to rise again. We don't want the disciples to steal the body. Does that show that maybe through Jesus' predictions and prophecy that he would die and rise again, that there is some expectation now of a singular resurrection of one person? Or are you bringing the distinction between resuscitation versus this is his new creation body, this is a different type of resurrection? Could you?
No, I actually think the second might be true, but the first, I think, since he had predicted he'd resurrect from the dead and he had quite a big following, they just wanted to make sure. It's not like they were expecting him to rise from the dead, right? They didn't think that was going to happen. So I think theologically, what scholars are saying is the New Testament writers, the New Testament apostles weren't expecting one guy to rise from the dead and be the Messiah. They knew that there'd be a general resurrection at the end of the day. But for the high priest to say, hey, put a guard on there, I think they were just being overly cautious because he was so popular and they just got rid of him. In fact, I think Caiaphas knew that Jesus was the Messiah, because right after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, what does Caiaphas say? First of all, he wants to kill them both, right? Because he wants to keep his job. But he says it's better that one innocent man die than the whole nation perish. So Caiaphas was willing to murder an innocent man in order to keep his job. So he was taking every precaution possible to prevent this. I don't think he thought he would rise from the dead. That wasn't an expectation. But since Jesus said so, and he had done some pretty amazing things, maybe we ought to just be sure.
Right.
Right.
Now, I'm going to just ask Joe before I come to you. I'm going to put out one of Tabitrus's 9 questions that he sent me, and just so that he can actually watch the video and maybe get an answer. One of the ones, he said, Joshua's witness stone at Shechem, as instructed upon entering Canaan, blessings and curses in Deuteronomy 27 and Joshua 24. Ernest Selling, German excavation temple and the sacred stone of Judges in chapter 8 and 9 of Judges. Can you highlight a little bit on those archaeological discoveries and the validity they bring to the Old Testament?
Yeah, the best thing you can do is go to Joel Kramer's website, Expedition Bible, and see his new video on it. He just put one out like a month ago on that very stone from Judges 8. Yeah, that was discovered. And you got to watch Joel's video on it, because there was like an argument between 2 archaeologists as to the significance of it. But that stone was indeed discovered, and it's there right as Judges 8 says it would be there. And this was discovered in Shechem, not far from where Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim overlook Shechem. So I would just refer that gentleman to that video that Joel does on it. In fact, I can probably find it right now on the Expedition Bible website. It's probably 20 minutes long, so it's not something I can show right now.
While you're doing that, Frank, I'm just going to give him a follow-up question since he's not here to represent himself.
Yeah, he put it out a month ago. It's called The Discovery of Joshua's Great Witness Stone at Shechem.
I've seen it. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
His second question is, what is the earliest writing or manuscript of the Bible discovered by archaeologists, and how do manuscripts match up to the Bible we have?
The earliest inscription or verse of the Bible we know is it was a lead or silver amulet that was unfolded. It's in the Israel Museum, and it's that famous blessing. I'm trying to think, it's either from Numbers or
Six.
Leviticus.
Number 6. Yeah.
Yeah, where it says, may the Lord's face shine upon you. May the Lord bless you. You know that they've
Yes.
discovered that it was a silver. I want to say it was a silver amulet. It was discovered in Jerusalem, and it was unfolded. And that's the oldest piece of scripture that we have inscribed somewhere. It probably comes from, I want to say, the 6th century BC, somewhere in there. But with regard to manuscripts, the New Testament manuscripts we have nearly 6,000 of those between, say, the early 2nd century and the time of the printing press, just in Greek. There's many others in other languages. And the best manuscripts we have for the Old Testament actually come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the entire book of Isaiah. That great Isaiah scroll is really the centerpiece of the Shrine of the Book Museum in Jerusalem. And it's 24 feet long. It contains the entire book of Isaiah from about 250 or 150 BC is probably the better date. And when you compare that scroll to the next earliest scroll we had, complete scroll, which is about 1,100 years later, the Masoretic text, they're about 95% identical. And the differences that they do have are like word order. They're not anything significant. So, and that's true of variants among all of these manuscripts. The variants are not significant. The biggest 2 variants we have in the New Testament is we're not quite sure if the ending of Mark is original, which would be Mark, say, 16:9-20. And we're not sure if the story of the woman caught in adultery is true. We think it sounds like a story from Jesus, but we're not exactly sure where it's supposed to be in the Bible. Because it wasn't in the earliest manuscripts. And there are different ways of explaining that. But those are the 2 biggies. None of that affects any doctrine. Even if those aren't in the Bible, they don't change any doctrine.
Can I ask you a question on that? Because I get questioned on that quite a bit coming from a charismatic perspective, is that all of the early church fathers have quoted each one of those verses from 9 through 20, not 21.
Mm-hmm.
Appears that if we didn't have in the Bible, we could actually put much of the Bible, New Testament, together just from what's quoted from the early church fathers, and including Mark 16:9-20. Every one of those verses are referenced by one of the early church fathers, as I've understood. Is that correct?
I don't know. I would want to see that. That would be a pretty good argument, depending upon how early those church fathers are.
Yeah.
Right. And are they literal quotations from Mark 16, or are they similar quotations from other passages? I don't know.
I'll send that over.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. Yeah. Hey, I mean, it's an interesting theological question, but no matter which side you fall on it, it doesn't affect any theology. Right.
So, yeah.
Except handling snakes, and that's why I don't do it, Leo.
Well, and actually, the Greek says that snakes are taken up like Paul and thrown off. So,
okay,
better translation, wrong translation.
That's better.
So I'm going to come to Joe, who is also planting a church on the campus at North Carolina State University. And so, Joe, would you, Margie, have any question that you'd want to ask? And
thank you, Leo. Thank you, and thank you, Frank. Really enjoyed this time, and I want to harken back to something you said that really I took notice of when you said that the hot issue really on the campuses today is morality, morality, morality. And I'm wondering if you have, if you know of as we talk about apologetics, is there a good apologetics of morality that Gen Zers would appeal to in their intellect and their flesh, but they would make sense to them as we try to win them for Christ. If biblical evidence for the archaeological resurrection of Jesus and the existence of God, etc., they listen and they go, well, I'm still going to do my own thing. Is there a good biblical apologetic for sexual morality that you know of that really appeals to Gen Zers?
Well, I would ask a Gen Zer, do you think you have certain rights? See what they say. Oh, yeah, we got this right and that right. I mean, Gen Zers seem to be inventing rights every 10 minutes, right? We got trans rights now. Okay, my question is, first of all, what are trans rights? And secondly, why do you think they are rights? Because if there is no God, there is no right to anything. Everything's just a matter of opinion. I mean, there's not only no trans rights, there's no human rights. There's no Christian rights. There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage. There are no rights anywhere for anyone unless God exists. Because if they say, oh no, rights are given to us by government, then they're not rights, they're just preferences. Because if a new government comes in and changes the law, does that mean you don't have those rights anymore? If they were true rights, you'd still have them. And you couldn't in any way convict the Nazis for what they did because they were just following their government. If people just get together and decide what's right and wrong, then how can you say the Nazis were wrong?
Right.
If you say the Nazis were wrong because they killed people, you could say, well, why is it wrong to kill people?
Right. Right.
If a group of Nazis get together and say it's fine to kill people, why are they wrong? There's got to be an external standard of righteousness beyond ourselves that we're obligated to obey for rights to exist and for right and wrong to exist. And that only exists if God exists.
Good.
So out of the three major arguments that we give on a college campus for God, the cosmological argument from the beginning of the universe, the design argument from fine-tuning and biology, and the moral argument, probably the one that resonates the most is the moral argument, because you can ignore design, you can ignore the beginning, you can't ignore morality, you traffic in it every day. In fact, Charlie Kirk and I, we were together this past week and I was on his program, we were talking about this, and he kind of asked the same question. And I said, well, the very same people who claim that rights are they just come from the group majority vote, they would say, if they say lived in Oklahoma, which they just outlawed abortion in Oklahoma, they would say the government of Oklahoma is wrong for outlawing abortion. Whoa, no, they can't be wrong.
That's right.
Right? They're just a group of people that got together and said, hey, we're going to outlaw abortion. How are they wrong if there's no standard beyond what the group says? If you're going to say there is a standard beyond what the group says, now you're back to God. So Gen Zers, when you're young, you have this overdeveloped sense of justice, which is a good thing, right? It motivates you to try and make a change in the world. But justice only makes sense if God exists. If there's no God, nothing's just or unjust. Things are just different.
Yeah, it's good.
So you can say, hey, take all that interest that you have in justice and trace it back to the source.
Mm-hmm.
Where does justice come from? It comes from obeying a standard of righteousness. What is that standard? Not how do you know it, but what is it? Where does it come from?
Right.
It only comes from God. And now we're not saying that you can't be good without God. You're not saying you don't know good without God. What we're saying is you can't justify what good is without God. Right? Just like you could be driving down the street and see the speed limit, 70 miles an hour. You can know what that speed limit says and obey the speed limit while denying there's a traffic authority. Right?
Right.
But there would be no speed limit unless there was a traffic authority. So you can know what right and wrong is. You can obey right and deny there's a God, but there would be no right to obey unless there was a God.
You did a great job on Charlie Kirk. And I just want to say at 62, I'm really commending you for taking your apologetics to the arena where people live every day, particularly right now in the political time. And you did last night with Pastor Hibbs, and the access to that video, if you can mention that, is you did a good job last night being able to distinguish between inalienable rights and civil rights. Civil rights are given and can be taken away by the civil government, but inalienable rights are given by God and should not be taken away for the right to life, for the unborn, etc. So can you distinguish between those two and talk about how we can follow your apologetics within the political arena with Pastor Hibbs and others.
Yeah, that's on our YouTube channel, How to Love Your Neighbor Through Politics. That was the show we did last night, so you can see it on our YouTube channel. But I want to ask Joe. Joe, you're almost a neighbor. I'm in Charlotte. You're in what, like Raleigh?
Actually, Clayton, which is
Okay.
about 30 minutes away from Raleigh. Yeah.
Okay. So do you do work on the campus there?
Yes, my wife and I are at NC State.
Okay. Do you know, is Mike Mahaffey still there at Crew?
You know, that's a great question. When we first, we're pretty new on the campus, but this is our third year. And in my first year, I met him, got together, had a little lunch at Bojangles, and met him, and but then lost touch because I gave him my email and asked him to keep in touch with anything going on in terms of ministries coming together to pray and things like that. And I never heard from them, so I can't answer that question with any accuracy.
All right. Well, I've been there also with some other groups, not just Mike's group, but other groups. So if you ever want to do an event at NC State, let me know, because you're not that far away.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Leah will give me your contact.
Sure. Yeah.
You put it in the chat.
Thank you so much. So Frank, I'm going to ask Chantal, has never come on question. If she wants to ask, now's its time before we close. But I'm going to ask if Chantal doesn't come on, for the one marketplace minister. Oh, he just went off. I was going to ask. No, there he is, William. Bill Shera, and he was a missionary down in Venezuela, eventually on staff at Michigan State with us, his wife, my wife, college roommates, etc. And so William is a marketplace minister who's just tapped in here at the end. All these different ministers who will probably pray long prayers before we dismiss. But I'm going to ask this marketplace minister to close us out. And Bill understands, he's one of my ministry partners, why we have apologists and campus evangelists, and why we have the Alliance of Campus Evangelists and Apologists, campusevangelist.com, for the purpose of having men like yourself, Frank, who at 62 carry your apologetics to the arena of the campus. And we're really proud of what you do. Want to thank you for that. I don't think Chantal has any particular question because I don't see him coming on. Bill, any question you want to ask before you close us out here?
No, I'm going to have to go back and look at Frank's website to get the rest of this thing, because I had to check in a little late today. So I'll do that. So that's great.
All right. Thank you.
Do you want me to close out right now, Leo?
Yes, unless you got a question. Blessing on
no, good getting to see at least you guys, and maybe I'll be able to attend a little bit longer. But Lord, we come now before you. Our hearts is to see people come to know you. And Father, our hearts are to break down strongholds that prevent people from hearing the truth. Lord, we pray in Jesus' name for the Holy Spirit to quicken our words, Father, that it'll not just be mere words, but in power. And Father, just in mere words, that our words will make sense to our soul, that you quicken those words to pierce into their spirit, Father, that Father, it breaks strongholds, it breaks out of the echo chambers, and Father, that people hear what we're saying and see that it's not a fantasy, Lord, that is based on real apologetics, that it takes more faith to be an atheist than a Christian, and see that there is evidence, Lord. It takes faith, but that faith is best based on evidence, Lord. It's the total picture is beyond what we can see, but their faith is not without evidence. Lord, we ask for that now, that empowerment, that quickening, and that anointing on everybody who's speaking these words and the apologetics that you have given us, Father, so that we can approach these people in Jesus' name.
Amen. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
We love you, friend. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
All right. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thanks. Good to see you guys. God bless.
Thank you.
Good to see you.